down the long hallway, bouncing off the marble floors like a cruel melody. Melissa stood frozen at the doorway, her hand still gripping the edge of the tray she was holding, a thin sheen of sweat forming on her forehead. The man sitting at the long, gleaming dining table, Chase Winters, was laughing at something one of his friends had said, and all eyes were on her. It was always like this. It always had been. Look at her, one of his friends said, a sneer creeping into his voice. How old are you, sweetheart? 16? 17? Melissa didn't answer. She never did. Instead, she lowered her gaze, trying to ignore the humiliation that prickled at the back of her neck. Her uniform, an unflattering maid's outfit, seemed to be the punchline of every joke. The silk gloves, the polished shoes, the apron. It all felt like a costume in a play she was forced to perform. Chase, the millionaire heir of the Winters empire, leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of wine between his fingers as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes met hers, and for a split second, she saw something flicker in them. A hint of superiority, the belief that he was better than everyone else in the room. And then he smiled. Tell me, he drawled, his voice rich and arrogant. What's it like to be so insignificant? The room fell silent. The comment stung, and though she wanted to scream, to defend herself, to throw that tray in his face, Melissa stood there perfectly still. What would be the point? In his world, she was nothing more than a ghost. She had been hired to serve him and his guests, to clean up after their messes, to make sure everything ran smoothly. And no matter how many times she tried to tell herself that it was just a job, that it didn't matter, the truth was, every time he mocked her, every time they belittled her, it chipped away at her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Melissa, he said, leaning forward now, his smirk deepening. Are you too stupid to answer? She felt her face flush, her heart pounding, but she still didn't speak. Instead, she set the tray down on the table and quickly turned to leave. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave before the tears started to fall. But before she could get out of the room, he called after her, his voice laced with mockery. What's the rush? Don't you want to hear the rest of the joke? She gritted her teeth and kept walking. It had been a long time since Melissa had felt any sort of dignity in her life. Years of working in the shadows, cleaning after people who saw her as little more than a tool for their comfort. But the ridicule, Chase's mockery, had taken it to a new level. She hated the way he looked at her, the way he saw her as something to be used, something to be discarded. That night, she retreated to her tiny room at the back of the house, away from the laughter and the clinking of glasses, away from the world of wealth and privilege that seemed so far beyond her reach. The walls of her room were bare, save for a small cot and an old wooden dresser. The only light came from a flickering lamp on the nightstand. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Winters mansion, but it was the only world she knew. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking, a thought began to form in her mind. A dangerous, thrilling thought. She had been nothing but a servant, but that didn't mean she had to stay in that role forever. She was strong, capable. She was smarter than anyone in that room tonight. And yet, every time they looked at her, they saw a maid. They saw someone below them. But what if she could change that? What if she could make them see her differently? She was done being their punching bag. The next morning, as she slipped into her uniform and tied her apron tightly, Melissa knew she was no longer the quiet, invisible maid. She had been broken, but now, she was ready to rise from the ashes. The world she lived in was about to change, and so was she. It was a few days later when the knock came. Melissa had just finished cleaning the guest bathrooms when she heard the sound. The knock echoed through the house, and something in her chest tightened. She knew who it was before she even saw him. Chase Winters. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. She was ready for this. She had a plan now. She opened the door slowly, her hands steady, her face blank. Chase stood there, dressed in his usual tailored suit, a confident smirk on his face. But there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of concern. What do you want, Mr. Winters? Melissa asked, her voice colder than usual. His eyebrow quirked at the formality. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "For last night. I didn't mean to upset you." She didn't believe him. Not for a second. Chase Winters didn't apologize. He never had. But the lie was exactly what she needed. "Oh, it's quite all right," she replied, her voice smooth. "I'm used to it." He stepped forward, his eyes studying her intently. "I'm serious," he said, his tone a little more earnest than before. "I know I've been a bit of an ass. Let me make it up to you. Dinner tonight? Just you and me?" The words hit her like a slap, and she fought to hide her reaction. Was he really offering her dinner? Was he trying to make amends? She could see right through it. He wasn't apologizing, he was playing a game. But she wasn't going to back down now. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first walked into this house. "I'd love to," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. That night, she arrived at the lavish dining room, her heart beating in her chest. The dinner table was set for two, just her and Chase. The rich, dimly lit chandelier above cast shadows across his face, and she could see the faint glimmer of uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't know it yet, but tonight would be the start of his downfall. She took a seat across from him, her posture perfect, her eyes steady. "You wanted to make it up to me, Mr. Winters. I'm curious. What could you possibly offer that would make up for everything you've put me through?" Chase's smirk faltered for a moment, and she saw the crack in his armor. "I was thinking more along the lines of a fresh start," he said, his voice lowering. "Maybe we could start over?" Melissa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she picked up her wine glass, taking a slow sip as she studied him. The silence stretched on, heavy with tension, before she finally spoke. "You want to start over?" she repeated. "Interesting. But you see, Mr. Winters, I don't need a fresh start. What I need is something you can't give me." A flicker of confusion passed over his face, and she could see him struggling to keep his composure. He wasn't used to being challenged. "Tell me what you want, Melissa," he said, leaning forward, his voice soft but insistent. "Anything is yours." She set her glass down, her eyes never leaving his. "What I want is for you to understand the consequences of your actions," she said, her voice calm, but filled with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "I want you to know what it feels like to be insignificant, to be nothing, to be the one everyone looks down on. And then, I want you to see what happens when you underestimate someone." Chase froze. His confident facade cracked, and for the first time he saw her, not as the maid, but as something more dangerous, something he hadn't accounted for. The power shifted in that moment. "You're making a mistake, Melissa," he said, his voice now tinged with unease. "No," she replied, her voice steady. "You made the mistake, and now you're going to learn how it feels to lose everything." Chase's eyes widened for a brief second, his lips parted, but he didn't know how to respond. For the first time, Melissa saw the cracks in his armor, the facade of the wealthy, arrogant man beginning to break down. But she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping lower, each word laced with calm precision. "You think this is a game, don't you? That you can make a joke out of people like me, mock me, belittle me, and that's the end of it. But it's not. I'm not going to let you get away with it." Chase tried to mask his discomfort with a forced smile, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. He was no longer in control. Melissa was the one pulling the strings now. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously on the edge of his wine glass. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't you. You're just a maid. You don't have the power to do anything to me." The words stung, but they didn't faze her. She had heard it all before. The same insults, the same belittling tone. But now the roles had reversed. "Don't mistake my silence for weakness, Chase," she said, her eyes locking with his. "The truth is, I've been waiting for the right moment. And now that I've got your attention, it's time for you to see just how far you've pushed me." He laughed nervously, clearly trying to regain his composure. You really think you can take me down? You're nothing but a pawn in my world. You're replaceable. Disposable. The words cut through her like a knife, but she wasn't intimidated anymore. Not after everything she had endured in this house. Not after every insult, every cruel remark, every time they had looked down on her. Melissa stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor as she walked toward the window, her back to him. The view of the city lights below was breathtaking, but it didn't matter. Nothing did except for the next step in her plan. You're right about one thing, she said quietly, turning back toward him. I'm nothing in your world, but you know what? Your world isn't the only one that matters. Chase's eyebrows furrowed, and he straightened in his chair, suddenly on edge. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Melissa's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. It means, Chase, that I'm done being underestimated. I'm done being your joke. You've made me believe for too long that I don't have power, but I do. And you're about to see just how much of it I've been holding on to. She walked back to the table, her steps confident now, and took a seat, never breaking eye contact. The tension between them was palpable, thick in the air. Let's see what happens when I start using the power that you think I don't have. The following days were a blur for Melissa. She didn't have time to waste. She was calculating every move, every word, every interaction, building her plan in the shadows while Chase continued to treat her as nothing more than a maid. But in her mind, the game had already begun. One evening, as the sun began to set, Chase was in his study, and Melissa stood at the doorway, a soft knock echoing in the silence. She could hear him muttering to himself, probably working on yet another business deal, oblivious to the storm that was brewing outside his perfect little world. Come in, he called, his voice authoritative but distracted. Melissa pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, her presence subtle but deliberate. She walked into the room slowly, taking in the opulence of the space. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, expensive leather furniture, a desk covered with papers and important documents. Everything screamed wealth, power, control. Everything except for her. She cleared her throat lightly, catching his attention. I have something for you, she said, her tone soft but laced with purpose. Chase looked up from his desk, the usual smirk crossing his face as he took in her presence. Oh, what's this? Another surprise? Melissa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped forward and set a folder down in front of him. The papers inside were thick with legal jargon, carefully prepared, meticulously researched. I thought you might want to know something, she said, her voice calm, almost conversational. Something about the company you've been working so hard to build. Chase raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. What's this? A new business proposal? She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. No, it's information. About you. His expression shifted. The hint of amusement vanished, replaced by a flicker of wariness. What are you talking about? Melissa leaned in slightly, her gaze never leaving his. I know about the offshore accounts, the money you've been hiding, the deals you've been making under the table. You thought no one would ever find out, didn't you? Chase's face paled, and he stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're bluffing, he said, his voice low and sharp. No, she said, her tone unwavering. I'm not bluffing. I have everything here, Chase. All the evidence. If you want to keep your little empire intact, you'll start treating me with respect. If you don't, I'll make sure everything comes crashing down. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the folder in front of him, then to Melissa's calm face. For a moment, he looked like a man caught in a trap he couldn't escape. His mind raced, calculating his next move. But there was no escape. The trap was set. You think you can control me? He asked, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Melissa stood her ground, her expression cold and firm. I don't want to control you, Chase. I just want you to see what happens when you push someone too far. The following days brought a new kind of tension into the house. Chase Winters, the man who had once looked down on Melissa, was now in her grasp. The power had shifted, but Melissa wasn't done yet. She knew this was only the beginning. She had set the wheels of change in motion, and nothing would stop her now. She watched from the sidelines as Chase scrambled to protect his empire, but Melissa could see the cracks in his carefully built world. The calm facade was starting to crumble. Every phone call, every meeting, every interaction now had a hidden agenda. Melissa was in control, and she made sure he knew it. Chase tried to regain some of his footing by offering her more money, more privileges, more status. But none of it mattered. Melissa wasn't in this for the power or the wealth. She was in it for one thing: retribution. She wanted him to feel the humiliation she had felt all those years. She wanted him to understand what it felt like to be beneath someone else's heel. And slowly, as the days wore on, she began to see it. The cracks in Chase's armor deepened. The arrogance, once so strong, was now gone. It was replaced by something else: fear. Melissa was no longer invisible. She wasn't the maid. She wasn't the servant. She was the storm that would bring him to his knees. But she wasn't done yet. The days following Chase's realization that he was no longer in control were filled with tension. Every word he spoke seemed carefully measured, every step calculated. It was as though the man who once walked through life like a king, who thought nothing could touch him, had become a shadow of his former self. Melissa watched from the sidelines, her mind working tirelessly to ensure that she didn't just break him. She would make him understand. She was no longer the quiet, invisible maid. Now she was a force to be reckoned with. And while she had the upper hand, she had no intention of letting up. Her plan was unfolding perfectly, but she needed to stay patient. The final blow had to be precise. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house grew quieter, Melissa knew it was time. She had been observing every interaction between Chase and his inner circle. She had gathered the evidence she needed, and now, she had to push him into a corner. Chase had started avoiding her, not because he wanted to, but because he knew that every interaction with her meant he was closer to the abyss. Every time their eyes met, he saw the woman he had mocked, belittled, and disrespected. And now, she was his reckoning. Melissa entered the lavish office where Chase sat, his back turned to her as he examined some files. Without a word, she stepped into his line of sight, standing tall, her gaze unwavering. He froze when he saw her, and for the first time, she saw the unease flicker in his eyes. "What do you want now?" he asked, his voice tinged with both arrogance and fear. She didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch between them, suffocating, heavy. Finally, she walked closer to the desk and placed a neatly folded piece of paper in front of him. "What's this?" he asked, his voice guarded. He had no idea what was coming. He never did. "It's over, Chase," she said, her voice calm but with an edge. "Everything. I've had enough. Your time is up." He picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the document. His face began to pale as he realized what she was holding. The truth was right there, in black and white, proof of the illegal dealings, the money laundering, the web of corruption he had so carefully hidden. This is nothing," he sputtered, his voice shaking. "You can't prove anything." Melissa smiled, a cold, confident smile. "You think that, don't you? But I've been one step ahead of you this entire time. I have all the proof, Chase. Every last bit of it." The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. His hands trembled as he clutched the paper, his once unshakable confidence faltering. "You can't," he began, but she cut him off. "No, you can't," she said, her voice steady, cutting through his denial like a blade. "You thought you could walk all over me. You thought I was just some maid, some invisible part of your world that you could discard whenever you wanted. But here's the truth, Chase. You're not the powerful man you think you are. And now I'm the one who controls the game." She watched as his face turned red, his hands tightening into fists. The anger that had once been so intimidating now looked pathetic, desperate. He stood up, knocking over his chair in his haste, but Melissa didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "You think this is over?" he seethed, his voice rising in a controlled rage. "You think you can ruin me? You're just a maid." "I'm not just anything anymore," she interrupted. "I'm your reckoning." Her words struck him like a physical blow. He took a step back, his breathing heavy. He was no longer the man who held all the power. Melissa had turned the tables completely. He knew she was serious. He knew there was no way out of this, no way to escape the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his life, he felt small, insignificant, helpless. "Melissa," he said, his voice softer now, but tinged with desperation. "Please, please," she repeated, her voice low and almost mocking. "After everything you've done to me, after everything you've put me through, you think I'll show mercy?" He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was grasping at the edges of his power, but it was slipping through his fingers. The smug confidence he had once had was gone. He was broken. The consequences came swiftly. Melissa didn't waste time. She made sure the information she had gathered was sent to the right people: law enforcement, lawyers, journalists. She made sure every secret, every crime he had committed was exposed to the world. The same world he had manipulated and controlled for so long. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and legal battles. Chase's empire began to crumble, piece by piece. His assets were frozen, his business partners turned against him, and the public turned their back on the man who had once been untouchable. And through it all, Melissa watched from the shadows. She didn't need the fame or the recognition. The satisfaction came from knowing that she had taken control of her life. She had used every weapon at her disposal: intelligence, patience, and sheer willpower, to take down the man who had wronged her. Chase's downfall was a spectacle. The man who had once mocked her, who had humiliated her, was now facing criminal charges, his wealth and power stripped away. The mansion that had once been his symbol of dominance became a hollow shell of what it had been. The wealth, the luxury, it was all gone, and he was left with nothing. Melissa didn't attend the hearings. She didn't need to. She had already won. Her victory wasn't about seeing him punished. It was about reclaiming her own life. It was about standing tall and showing the world, and herself, that she was no longer powerless. Months passed, and the dust settled. Chase Winters was a broken man. His wealth, his reputation, everything he had once thought was untouchable had been taken from him. The world had turned its back on him, and he was left to face the consequences of his own actions. As for Melissa, she had moved on. She left the mansion that had once been her prison. She found a new job, one that gave her respect, one where she wasn't invisible. She built a new life, one where she was in control. She didn't need revenge anymore. She had already claimed it. But there was one thing she would never forget. She had been underestimated. She had been crushed by the weight of others' judgment. But she had fought back. She had risen from the ashes and taken what was